بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you all well. Just a quick sound check. Hamza, if you can get a message over to me. I'll just wait once the sound's confirmed, inshallah. It seems okay on my side. Yep, brilliant. Okay, well, I just about got my webcam working. I've got a new one coming tomorrow, and so it's working, alhamdulillah, for this discourse. Now, shukran. So I did originally do this discourse on the 10th, but I wasn't too well that day, so I couldn't really complete it or get all my points across. So I'm going to repeat it today with some additions as well, and this may stretch over. It may be this session and one more session. It may not be next week, but it will be a part 2 to this. And the topic itself about arrogance and narcissism is, I think it's a very kind of important topic. I want to begin with kind of with the story of Iblis to a certain degree, because that highlights this kind of the first act of disobedience, you could say, or defiance, or I won't call it defiance, but kind of the first act that we know of amongst created beings in that sense, that had intelligence, of rejection of God's command in that sense. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about it in Surah Al-Baqarah, and it's in other surahs as well. But interestingly, it's the words that I want to look at. What's interesting are the words, and it's the words that I want to look at. Allah states in the Quran, وَإِذْ قُلْنَا الْمَلَائِكَةِ تسجدوا لآدم فسجدوا إلا إبليس أبى واستكبر وكان من الكافرين. That when God told the angels to prostrate to Adam, they all did so except for Iblis. This is possibly his name, or he was referred to by this particular word. If it were his actual name, we don't know. There's a whole discussion on that. If it were one of his names, if it were an attribute, and Iblis, the word means something specific, but regardless, he refused to do it. And the two words that God uses in the Quran, the two verbs to describing, are very interesting. Allah says Aba, and then Allah says wastakbara. The first word that God used, Aba, that he refused, he rejected, this denial almost. That because rejection normally comes from somewhere, like there's already an ideal in mind, or there's something in your mind whereby you're whatever you're being told to do or accept conflicts with that idea. So Abba, he rejected, and we all know later in the Quran and in our tradition that why he rejected this kind of core, possibly jealousy, kind of hasad that he had, and other things as well. There are various things that I don't really want to discuss the story of Shaitan himself. I think I may have discussed this in Devil in the Details in that discourse. And then Allah says wastakbara. This is the interesting point. And he became arrogant, or he showed a sense of arrogance to God. Now, these two words, these two words are very interesting in the way that God describes him. And the reason, therefore, it's so important to look at this topic is because if it's the first act of the devil that causes him to be distant from God, kind of removed from God's mercy in that sense, then we should kind of look at it closely, and how it affects us and how to avoid it. Now, in the Sunnah, in the Quran, you have many verses kind of generally about the topic, and I want to kind of look at those as well. So this particular discourse may be a little more kind of information orientated. So giving verses and some commentary to them. So for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Quran, وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إنك لن تخرق الأرض ولن تبلغ الجبال طولا. It's almost as if God throughout the Quran describes human beings or addresses them often by highlighting their attitude in a sense. Especially in the verses where God is warning them, there's this kind of a warning from God of how to, how not to transgress the boundaries that God has set, etc. Especially when it comes to spirituality, God says, وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا, like don't walk on the earth full of pride. And there are other various verses like this that God talks about the idea of walking. Now, walking, of course, doesn't need to be literal. It doesn't mean that the way you walk on the street. It means do not carry yourself in life in this way, in kind of a way that you feel better than other people. And we're going to get to in the narcissism section, inshallah, we're going to cover that a bit more. إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقِ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. Meaning, God talks about you will never be able to kind of part the earth in a sense, or destroy the earth. You don't have the power to cause anything significant in that sense. وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا, nor will you be as tall as the mountains. Meaning being kind of stay in your lane in a sense. We kind of find this, especially when you watch I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd, a sci-fi kind of historically I've always loved sci-fi movies, sci-fi addict, and especially movies that where they go out to outer space. But if now with all the tech, that all the kind of CGI and things like that they have, you get a kind of real picture of what it feels like to be in empty space. But what you also get is a picture of how insignificant the earth seems to be in terms of size. And when they see like far away, like in Interstellar and other movies, imagine us then on the earth and how insignificant we are. And God always gives these kind of cosmic kind of examples, or even worldly examples like this about the mountains. In another verse, Allah says, "Inna Allah la yuhibbu kulla mukhtalin fakhur," that God dislikes every mukhtal and fakhur, every arrogant and boastful person. And inshallah, we'll break those two down as well in a short while. In the third verse that I want to kind of highlight is the verse that سَأَصْرِفُ عَنْ آيَاتِ الَّذِينَ يَتَكَبَّرُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ, that we will, and this is a really interesting one, that arrogant people, one thing that's quite clear about them, distinct about them, is that they have a blindness about them, or blind spot to anything that's against their version of events or their way they see the earth, the way they see the world, and the way they see people, that they're completely blind to it. And often really arrogant people or incredibly narcissistic people, extreme narcissists, it doesn't matter what you show them, it still doesn't change their view of things, because there's something deeper that they can't overcome. And what's incredible is that Allah talks about that in the Quran in almost exact terms. He states that سَأَصْرِفُ عَنْ آيَاتِ, I will kind of turn away from my signs those people who are arrogant in the earth, or without any right, meaning they have no right to be, to be boastful, or, and God generally is talking about everybody that does this. But what's interesting is God is talking about how arrogant people, that they lose kind of sense of truth, and they lose sense of seeing or seeing clearly. And this is why when we explore the idea of arrogance, we look at the spiritual harms that it causes. Before we get to the types of arrogance itself, if we just look at a basic level that everybody understands, the level of spiritual harm it causes, one of the greatest points to that is the idea that they often harm other people, but more so than anything else, they harm themselves, and they can't spiritually elevate or evolve. They're just stuck in their kind of core shame. They're kind of stuck in a state where they just can't grow spiritually. And this brings me to my point about the ego. Bear in mind that the ego is everything that we know is bad spiritually. It's it may have some foundations also in our tradition. The ego, the idea of the qarin, this entity almost that is created with us, that kind of influences us to do bad things. Now that could be explained as the ego itself, that it's in fact the ego, something that's negative, that doesn't allow you to want to kind of to find who they really are. The ego is just, it's not you essentially. And if you look at all traditions, they argue that the ego isn't you. The ego is something created by often social engineering and these things, or your experiences, but it's not you. And you have to get beyond the ego to the pure self, to find who you really are, and to find that kind of that historic relationship with God from pre-body existence. So the point here was that arrogance really harms spiritual progression. The irony, of course, is that often many religious people that claim to be religious, are often very, very arrogant. And we're going to talk about that a little later, how that is and why that is. Now, there is a clear definition of arrogance made by the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, or given by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he gives two distinct kind of characteristics of kibr. So we can all measure ourselves against these two principles. You can call them kind of universal principles related to kibr or related to arrogance. Remember, the word for arrogance, kibr, comes from the word the root word of something that's big. And that's why in the Quran Allah says wastakbara, meaning that he claimed to be mighty, the devil. He claimed to be greater than who he actually is. So the Prophet ﷺ said in a narration that batarul haqqi wa ghamtul nasi, gave two kind of principles of arrogance. The first one is batarul haqq, that he said that it's rejection of truth, what's true, what's real. And i.e., arrogance is defined as, one part of it is one's rejection of what's true. And so therefore your ego overtakes the discourse, or overtakes you in that moment, and you refuse to accept that you're wrong, for instance. It's a sign of arrogance. Even though something deep inside tells you that, depending how many layers you have of that, or you've created, how many kind of defense mechanisms already exist, you won't accept it. The second principle that the Messenger of God gave in this hadith is وَغَمْتُ النَّاسِ, that you belittle people. Now, the two types of arrogance, one could say, one is where it's kind of a boastful form of arrogance, the idea of the fakhur, the person who's constantly boasting. It doesn't really harm. It's like a self-indulgent narcissist. It just doesn't harm any other people, but just deluded in their own self-worth, and that's a less harmful one. But the more harmful one is one who harms other people. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, وَغَمْتُ النَّاسِ, that they يعني احتقارهم واستصغارهم, that the person, this arrogant person, now belittles another person to elevate themselves. In hadith literature, this word is often, kibr and istikbar, all these things, there's these kind of very simple words that were loosely translated as arrogance. However, now with all these new kind of studies and obsession with psychology and people's state of mind and why we do the things that we do, and the absence of a huge spiritual tradition, especially in the West, or the non-existence of a spiritual tradition, there is further investigation into why humans behave as they do. Now, we have a rich spiritual tradition that's already discussed this. For instance, our books of tasawwuf, spirituality, already have documented the soul, you could say, the spirit, or the soul, or the self, that's a better word to use, the self. So they in detail discuss the ego and the problems with the ego, and also the true self. And they have different kind of, like Sulami has a whole book on this, Sulami, where he talks about the degrees of the nafs, for instance. And so they talk about it within a particular kind of language, you could say. They use particular words and particular definitions for things, and they were a very specific way of looking at it. Other traditions are different, but they all are kind of discussing the same thing. even though they're using different words, or they're departmental, or they categorize it differently. And that is the idea of the nafs, the self, and then the ego and other things related to it. So we have a rich tradition, and our books of spirituality, we can open them and we can find answers and solutions to almost all of these problems, and they're all anchored heavily in the book and the sunnah. And the reason for that, of course, is because this is kind of divine information that we're receiving. We're receiving it from prophets, so it will be absolute truth. But in the West, there's not that. So they constantly investigating, and they're using the empirical method often to get to the bottom of it, which I'm going to discuss. But narcissism now is a big thing now in the West. And the reason it's got so much attention now, received so much attention, is because of social media. There's no doubt about that. It's because of our kind of global interactions now, that we're constantly interacting with each other and people that previously we wouldn't have had access to through social media, if that's through Insta Live or Snapchat, or now, what's the other one called? TikTok. And TikTok kind of is the absolute manifestation of kind of desperate seeking of validation, and it's amazing the spectrum. If you look at TikTok, like the types of people that are on there, and also age ranges, anything from little children to like old people that maybe they're reviving that the kind of sense of wanting them. And so it's an entirely a display of wanting to be accepted by people, or wanting to be liked by people. So maybe that's led to a lot of these discussions of narcissism, and also the fact that bullying has increased as well, often through social media. But because of our social interactions have increased to such a degree that everybody to some degree feels that they're a victim in some regard, even if that's through a WhatsApp conversation, or if it's on Instagram or on Facebook. But and that's due to us interacting so much with so many different people, often people we don't even know. Comments has kind of increased that kind of traffic as well, where people are putting videos up, or people are commenting and their comments are being commented on. So this interaction is not healthy at all. Read Sherry Turkle's book Alone Together. It's a very unhealthy form of interaction, because this form of interaction often is an interaction not between people, but between avatars that we've created on the internet that are not really us, but they're the worst form of ourselves. They're the absolute worst form. And so when human beings don't have discussions with you, I'll give a perfect example of it. Take a WhatsApp conversation where two people end up arguing. Yet if they were together in the same room, they probably wouldn't have argued, simply because of body language. You can feel the other person's energy. There's an actual real person sitting in front of you where you probably don't want to offend them or upset them. And there's certain barriers there. But on WhatsApp, they're not there. The person isn't there. It's just the avatar. It's just the drop pic of that person. And words, there's no real representation of that true person. It's just, a binary code. That's all it is. There, or just letters. And so we will reply from the worst part of ourselves. And so this is why everybody's concerned about this field in this area. And I do want to open it up today and have a look at it. And I wrote some stuff on it earlier, and I want to go through that. So narcissism first, the idea of it from Narcissus. It's a mythical story of this hunter, I think, who goes and finds a pond, and he looks in it and he becomes obsessed with his own reflection and falls in love with himself. So there's there's a huge spectrum here, and there's this promotion now of self-care and self-love and all these things. I do want to say this: my discussion today, my discourse, although I'm talking about narcissism, some elements of it, I'm trying to kind of place it in our traditional understanding of the topic of arrogance. Unfortunately, what we have now is the self-help type of kind of method is not very helpful often, and unfortunately, a lot of Muslim kind of social media influencers, you could call them. Umar came to mind, and he just told me to use the word influencer there. Influencers, people who have a large following on the internet, would what's happening now is that they talking about topics that they really don't have any kind of place to talk about. They do not have kind of any grounding in their own knowledge, within their own kind of studies, or within their own expertise, you could say, to be discussing these topics at all. But what's popular now is that, the idea of I've read a book and therefore I want to share what was in the book without cross-examining and synthesizing information and having a lot of experience in that field. And often they put out a lot of dangerous a lot of dangerous information, short courses, and especially when they're to do with the spirit and to do with the soul and the nafs and the self and people's emotions, you see, and it can be very, very dangerous. But it's a big thing now. It's a culture, unfortunately. So be very careful of that. They have problematic lives themselves, but seemingly they're trying to fix other people's lives. I really loved what Jordan Peterson said about that when he talked about when he kind of shot down this eco warrior and said, look, first fix your own house before you go around fixing other people's. I think that's one of his rules as well in his 12 rules of life. But anyway, so be careful of that. However, on the narcissism spectrum, we have different, obviously, extremes. So you have the extreme narcissist on one end, but you also have a person who has kind of zero level of narcissism, in the sense that if we're translating narcissism to a degree as some type form of self-love or self-worth, and some really start at the idea of self-love, that narcissism comes from self-love. Freud talks about this idea of self-love, and that's where narcissism comes from. I think he was one of the first people to have used the term in that way. And it comes from the idea of self-love, and that all of us have a level of narcissism in us anyway. But those people who have zero narcissism in them, it's argued that actually it's quite dangerous for them, because they live entirely a life of abstinence, and they feel completely kind of they're completely selfless, but they also feel completely worthless as well. But the way we utilize this word narcissism is slightly different now. We utilize it more in the idea of arrogance, in the idea of extreme narcissism. So I want to begin with that. Now, so there are different forms of narcissism. Of course, you have the extroverted narcissist, and you have the introverted narcissist, and communal narcissist. And just to give you an introduction, and if in our tradition, it would probably come under two areas. It would come under the idea of riya and kibar. These two areas, even it would feed into the idea of hasad as well in our tradition. So we have the idea of arrogance, we have the idea of riya, ostentation, showing off. That definitely comes into this idea of narcissism as well. And possibly you have this idea of these two definitely, I would say, fall in definitely these two. Just to kind of give you an introduction, where the extroverted narcissists are quite clear, where they're very boastful about their achievements, and often they put other people down through that. Or you even have sometimes a communal narcissist who are those people that might they're difficult to spot, but for some reason, have you kind of ever met somebody that you feel, this person's a little full of himself or full of herself, and they pride themselves of being, givers, that we do this for people and we do that for people, and they're constantly placing themselves on a pedestal for every good thing that they did. When in reality, although they do good things, but this is still a form of narcissism. And at the end, inshallah, I'm going to look at how our tradition kind of deals or tackles this. Now, number one, I want to say that with all this discussion of narcissism, be very careful of just like throwing the word around, saying, oh, you're a narcissist or you're a narcissist. It's very dangerous to do that. It's very similar to, not so long ago, where people were calling each other munafiqs. You're a hypocrite, you're a munafiq. Be very careful of, especially munafiq, of course, it has a kind of deep technical connotation in Islam. And Ibn Abidin, for instance, a great Hanafi jurist, talked about how one should never use it for other believers, because it's a very dangerous word. But we We often try to use these words for other people because it's popular, and so we should. And often I've heard now everybody using this term. This person's a narcissist. That person's a narcissist. We should probably not use it so much because it's quite dangerous just to throw this word around. Number one, we have the extreme end of narcissism, which is called NPD, which is a narcissistic personality disorder. And so people who have this as a mental health condition, it's they many of them often, or some of them often, you find them to be murderers or rapists or people of that kind, and it's quite rare that it's a disorder. So what we're more concerned with is kind of the idea of extreme narcissists and what they are. And I want to kind of look at some ideas or look at some ways of recognizing the different types today, although it's not going to be detailed, but it'll be, inshallah, quite general but beneficial at the same time. So extreme narcissists are terrified of being seen as inferior to others, and sometimes use vicious and elaborate tactics to maintain an image of superiority. So therefore, we find that many highly, for instance, celebrities are extreme narcissists. Just to call them out, people like Tiger Woods, and there have been studies on Tiger Woods, Madonna, and other people as well. Because it's not a coincidence that they ended up as being extremely popular celebrities. Not all celebrities, of course, I'm not arguing, are narcissists, but you do find a good number of them in that field, because that field kind of feeds the ego so much, you see. Because like I said at the beginning, these things like arrogance and narcissism and it's the ego, actually. It's not the self as in the pure self, it's the ego, this thing that's been socially engineered to influence our behavior. Now, some have argued, and this is a really interesting idea, I'm not saying this is fact, but this is argued by and discussed in many studies, is the one that I read today as well, on this idea that narcissism is based in or anchored in core shame. And so, for instance, I read a study today by Catherine Ritter and others, which she concluded that our findings, and it was a study that they did, a certain amount of people, that our findings indicate that shame is a prominent feature in NPD, that's narcissistic personality disorder. Implications for diagnosis and treatment are discussed in that particular paper. So what is this core shame? Some say it's possible that something happened in their childhood, a feeling of being unloved, for instance, and by parents, neglect, or overindulgence by parents that was negative, and we're going to kind of talk about that. And so what happens is that core shame is triggered when a person's self-esteem is shaken when they grow older, or they're criticized by others, and this causes something that some call narcissistic injury, where now you built up these kind of defense mechanisms to reply, and that's where that's what we now see in terms of narcissistic traits. So it starts off from this core shame, and then it never goes away. They never deal with it, and so they become narcissistic people, and they begin to treat other people based on that core shame, that original core shame that they have, and they never dealt with. Their reactions are anchored in that. Now, they build incredibly one distinct thing. Like I said at the beginning, of course, that everybody has a sense of a kind of element of narcissism in them. Don't get me wrong. If we are going to define that as self-love, everybody has, of course, are concerned about themselves. But even narcissism, and if at the very basic level one defines narcissism as a lack of empathy for other people, then definitely, there are always moments in our lives where we have not shown empathy to other people, towards other people. So therefore, we all carry this element of narcissism in us. And what's very important in our tradition is that our tradition accepts that people have arrogance in them, that we all have a level of arrogance or an element of riya showing off. We all have that. But what our tradition teaches us is how to control that, and how to, I wouldn't say overcome that entirely, because arrogant people probably will be struggling with that for the rest of their lives. But our tradition gives us ways of kind of suppressing that and controlling that and becoming a better person And it never has denied our spiritual tradition the existence of these things in most people to a certain degree. And prophets are perfect and free from all these things, but normal people, of course, they suffer from these things to some degree, or at some moments it comes out. So we have to accept that as human beings, that we're going to have these moments. And our spiritual tradition teaches us on how to control these things. So it's not like people should be like, oh, everybody else is a narcissist and I'm the victim. That's a completely the wrong way to look at it. And I'm going to talk about that particular point right at the end. It's going to be my last point, inshallah. So we can start with parents, for instance, and you have the narcissistic parent who bullies their children. You may have been a victim of that. So, in my own kind of dealings, obviously, a lot of people come to me and approach me just by the nature of the field I'm in, and who have problems in their lives or struggling with certain things, and then they open up about these things often, about how their parents possibly treated them, bullied them. Daughters, often their mothers have bullied them, or fathers who have demoralized their sons and completely destroyed their self-esteem and confidence, and taken out all their kind of problems that they had on their children. I remember I watched an interview by Vlad TV. Those who know Vlad TVs. Anyway, he's a guy who in America who interviews hip hop artists and people in hip hop and rap music and in that industry. And so he interviewed a guy named, what was it? I can't remember his name, but this guy was part of the security setup for Death Row Records back in the 90s for Suge Knight. And a very interesting story he has. And he tells a story about, it was this guy and his brother and a few others had a really bad life, but he talks about his childhood and about his father, and that how his father would just beat him for nothing. He said he'd do nothing and he'd just take his belt off and beat him until he almost died. And then he said that he hated his father, and he talked about this incident where he actually was contemplating killing him. He had a gun in his hand. His father was in the room. Somebody passed him a gun, and he said, I had no kind of feeling. Like I would have killed him. I wouldn't have regretted it. And really, really interesting his story was. But obviously, he had a terrible. Not everybody's kind of experienced that. But some people do. Where their parents are these narcissistic bullies, and often it's because they were themselves treated like that, and they've taken it out on somebody else. This is the telltale sign of a narcissist, where they now lose empathy for other people and begin to take it out on those people. So you have that type of parent, but also you have the other parent who is the overindulgent. And by the way, for instance, the Prophet ﷺ talked about that, how to treat your children. And we all fall short in bringing up on our children, and we all feel bad. Of course, none of us are perfect parents, and me definitely. So we're always trying to work on that. But as a parent, we should definitely recognize that we could be better parents. If we just recognize that, that's enough, I think, to times that our children, and it's very useful that couples remind each other that, don't you think that you were a bit harsh? And the other says, don't you think you were a bit harsh? And that, and you discuss it together. It should be a healthy discussion, how possibly they can improve their relationship with their children. And you need both of them. When that's not there, then they're left to their own devices, and nothing will ever be solved, or it will never be solved if it's just two parents apart. And this is why single parent families, of how much of a bad effect it has on the children, because they're not reminding each other, you see, because the husband will always pick up things in the wife, and the wife in the husband. And if they're constantly reminding you, say, look, you shouldn't have said that to him, or her, and you think maybe, and you have a good relationship where you accept correction from one another, then you're like, okay, I need to. And when they don't do that, you'll see in families, when there's not that healthy relationship of correction amongst the couple, with correcting each other, you'll see that their parenting is not very good, because parenting is this kind of team effort in that sense. So that's one way to solve that problem or become better at it. But we as parents should not. We should we should learn from the mistakes of our own parents, you know. And yeah, so you know, I remember a story. I'll tell you that he's, Sajid Bhai from Watford, rahimahullah. We were sitting once and we were having, so I just finished class, and he said to me that, and we were talking about parenting, and he said to me sometimes, he said, I feel that we are just repeating the mistakes of our own parents. And at that time, my children were very young, you know, very young. This is like in 2012. Um, in fact, I don't think my younger daughter wasn't even born. She's 9 years old now. So, or they're very young. So I didn't fully understand that. But he said, that's how I feel sometimes. And now I understand it, you see, because sometimes we do things without thinking. And what we come to realize later and reflect over them, we're just repeating the mistakes of our own parents. So, anyway, then there's the overindulgent parent who uses their child to boost their own self-fragile or their own fragile ego. They mold their children to fit some ideal so they feel superior to other parents. So they're already fractured, and what they do is they use their children to live their life through the one they wanted through, and they often damage their children. So there's this overindulgence, you could say, that this is another behavior of a narcissist. You see, they utilize other people to fulfill their own kind of fragile, kind of broken selves, broken kind of egos, not egos, but a broken self. Now, they incredibly harmful. And just to give you some examples of my own experiences. So, for instance, I mentioned in the last, if anybody tuned into the last version, this will be the full version of this discourse. I talked about homeschooling, for instance, and I found that in the homeschooling domain, that I was shocked, actually. I was really shocked. See, anything that's niche is often there, or anything that's specialist, not in specialist, but things that not many people do, and only a group of people do them, and they're looked at as an ideal. You have the most arrogant people in that field. And so people have created homeschooling, especially that whole domain has created this sense of superiority, almost this idea of elitism, where, the way to go is homeschooling, and homeschooling parents are the best, and they show their kids off, and they'll put their work up, and they'll even put the mom will put her schedule up, and and it's moms, I'm just going to be honest with you, because dads unfortunately are quite neglectful homeschoolers. Some are probably good, man, I'm not like, but mothers make better homeschooling kind of teachers, and people are more concerned with that. Us, we're quite neglectful in that sense. But you put them up like, oh, alhamdulillah, woke up after Fajr, and we start our day at Fajr. And then there's this poor woman who's struggling with her kids and got onto the homeschooling bandwagon because somebody convinced her, knowing her current, when I forget current, maybe it's just not for you. And she was kind of duped into it as an ideal, and how she should be, make her a better parent, how a bad parent she is sending her kids to school. And then there's this super mom who wakes up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and she does all the housework, and 7:15 she goes on her magical walk and takes her kids, breathing forest air. And then by 2 o'clock, they've completed all the work, and her kid's this little genius who can do algebra at the age of 7.5. And you can't even get fractions into your kid's head at the age of 11. And then you've got, cooking to do, and this to do, and that to do. And at 11 o'clock, you're just crying yourself to sleep. This is the type of what you have in homeschooling. And if you don't believe me, go and reach out to homeschooling parents who are actually going to tell you the truth about it and what it feels like. So, and it happens a lot. And there's a lot of bullying in that, and showing. So they're actually living, this is this overindulgent parent who actually is living their narcissism through kind of using their children for their own narcissism. And this is the idea of riya in our tradition, showing off, ostentation, fukhur, where Allah says He despises people who are fukhur, who show off, who are boastful, especially when our boasting affects other people's lives in this way. We know that that person is going to be affected by that. I'll give an example. What if somebody's just gone through a divorce, a really bad divorce, and you're sitting there talking about how good your husband is to you, how excellent he is. Why would you do something like that? Knowing that that person's just gone through a horrible relationship where her husband's being so horrible to her for many years. So we kind of forget that. We often forget what the other person may feel. And you're saying, but I'm just telling the truth, or I'm just sharing my experiences. But don't do it at the expense of hurting other people, especially consider their circumstance and their situation. And look how great the messenger of God was. And this man came to him, the greatest of all mankind. And this man comes to him, and he was a Bedouin, and he was shaking in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ put his arm around him. He said, "Why are you shaking?" And he like kind of inferred that, "Look, you're the messenger of God." And he said, "Look, I'm the son of a mother who would drink the milk of a goat and dry meat," meaning he never said, "I am the greatest of all creation." He never did that. He tried to make him feel comfortable, you see. And so empathy is incredibly important. It's part of prophethood, to understand another person's circumstance, and it often is seen where somebody's upset, or they go to talk to somebody else, and all they can do is talk about themselves. So anyway, this is the overindulgent parent who utilize their own children. Often then they create children like that. Now we have the next week, just a quick discussion on, I don't know how long I've left, but maybe 20 minutes. I'll do more. We've still got some different types to go through. The bullying narcissist now. Now, the bullying narcissists are very interesting, and I would say the bullying narcissists they're quite common, and they separate the world into winners and losers. That's the world for them: the ones who win and the ones who lose. And the bullying narcissists are the most obsessed with winning. They just want to win, and so being kind of the top dog for them and maintaining their inflated self-image is the most important thing to them. Now, their obsession with winning leads them to prey on anyone that's vulnerable. And this is the first stage of the bullying narcissist, that they will just prey on vulnerable people because, in our culture, we say that you only look for weak people. And I think it's in every culture that these types of narcissists are quite common. We find them to be quite common. Now, they seek out weak people who they can put down to make themselves feel more powerful. Interestingly, bullying narcissists are victims, and victims are very similar. So they're very similar to their victims in that unconsciously they both feel deeply insecure and inferior. So the bullying narcissist and the victim, they both feel insecure. Except that, remember at the beginning when I talked about some people, it's very dangerous to have not any self-love at all, because you feel entirely worthless then. Later in life, now what happens to the bullying narcissist is that they get sick of just bullying vulnerable people and inferior people, and it sometimes gets to a point later in their life where winning becomes so strong that bullying narcissists attack people more successful than them. And this is interesting, where they find people more successful and they'll just attack them. And you find this actually, interestingly, we never really look at religious people, and especially du'at. Well, I really don't like the word, but kind of preachers on the internet. We never look at them from a narcissistic through a narcissistic paradigm. That, these guys on the internet who constantly attacking each other, refutation after refutation, and sometimes refutation is needed, don't get me wrong, there is a point where responses are required, but the culture that we have now I believe it's a narcissistic culture. It's about winning. It's not about truth. It's about winning. And that's why in the books of debate, for instance, in our kind of study tradition, they have a difference between what they call a kind of a munadhara and a mujadala, and they even have something called a mukabara, which is this idea of pitting your arrogance against each other, just proving who's right, just for the sake of your your ego. And it actually takes they've got a term for it in debating. So all these kind of YouTube debates that you find, not all, but many of them that take place, where people are refuting each other, it's just pure narcissism. You see, It's that if you actually went and investigated and explored that person's life, generally you'll find them to be incredibly narcissistic, that they're very narcissistic people. And I'll give you an example. Some of them, they come across as really sincere, and you think they can't be narcissists, they're sincere. We're going to get to them. They're the seductive narcissist, you see. They may not be the bullying narcissist, because you think to yourself, oh, as a narcissist, somebody bullies another people, but there is the seductive narcissist who seduces you. So they may be that type. They may not be the bullying type, of course, but some of you do get their bullying types. So, for instance, an example of a bullying narcissist is Lance Armstrong, the cyclist. Remember, he got caught, after many, 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 many years. And interestingly enough, his core shame actually lies in the fact that he had a very hard childhood. He was incredibly poor. So he wanted to just prove everybody wrong, even if it's through cheating. And watch his interview. They did an analysis of his interview when he's caught and he admits to it. And he has no remorse in him. Nothing. He's just sitting there lying on his couch. The millions that he probably earned, just no remorse. But it's probably, they say it comes from his kind of core shame. That's where it came from, of growing up as incredibly poor. And so anyway, we move on to the seductive narcissist. They're charismatic. They exploit they exploit the way they exploit your narcissism to feed their own often. So they praise you only so you reciprocate. So they only pray, and somebody who has low self-esteem to begin with, when another person tells you how great you are and how lovely you are and how brilliant you are and how much they love you, and it feels good, you see. It feels like, oh, this person really likes me. They give you praise only when they start with firstly, they seduce you, catch you off guard, and you think, man, this person's brilliant, because they really make you feel that you're some self-worth almost. But then at the second stage, they will only praise you when they want you to do something. They kind of they begin to lose, because you may begin to realize that, they were a little horrible to me here and there, and they start to lose that. But when they want something from you, they'll be phoning you again and buttering you up again. And once you're caught in their net, you keep pursuing them because you're afraid of the core shame of unrequited or unrequited love, that you now feel that you may be abandoned. So you stay with them, and because of that original kind of memory that you have of them, you keep thinking that that's going to come back. But they're narcissists. They're not going to do that. They only did that to use you, to catch you in their net and keep you there. But you don't leave them as well, because you feel that, I feel abandoned, a sense of abandonment, that they showed you some love and you rather have some than nothing, even if it's with this narcissist. Now, they have an idea of anti-dependency in them that makes them resistant to getting attached to people, but they still crave attention. You'll find these people having very few actual friends. The seductive narcissist, they won't really have many friends. Most narcissists don't have many friends, but especially this group, they don't have many friends, but they have a lot of people that they control who they call friends. The seductive narcissist will have friends, but they're not really friends. They're people that are caught in their net, and it takes years sometimes for them to get out of it. You see. But because they crave attention, they need that much, but they won't commit themselves to other people because they can't do that. So they make people fall in love with them without ever committing themselves to those people. The best way to cope with a seductive narcissist is to be suspicious of people who adore you at the moment they meet you. Ask yourself, what do they really want from me? Take your time in analyzing people. Don't just give yourself to people. Here's an interesting thing, that in our pseudo charlatan-ridden spiritual circles that we have people, it's full of narcissists. And often these false spiritual leaders bring people in that way. You meet them and somebody tells you that other person, the poor person who's been the victim of this sense of seductive narcissism, probably brought you in. You need to come and meet my sheikh and my kind of person, that this great spiritual, and they seduce you, mashallah, who are you? Masha, and they really big you up and bring you in, and you think, oh, I've met this great saint of a person. Before you know it, you're just their Joey, you're just their runner, as we call them on the streets. You're just doing things for them, tutoring their children and doing their chores and lining up their shoes and hoovering their car and driving them around and answering their emails and dedicating a portion of your monthly wage to them. And because they're such spiritual masters, go and read the biographies of spiritual masters. They're never like this. Spiritual masters were humble people, often were incredibly poor, never revealed their spirituality to the public. Where on earth did they become this? They're a bunch of narcissists. But they pull you in under the idea of the guise of khidmah and barakah, so you become their shoe cleaner or their toilet cleaner because you hear the story of Imam Ghazali. They used of Imam Ghazali cleaning toilets and things like that, and to gain a high spiritual. And now you're going to become the Ghazali of the age by serving this narcissist. Well, really, it's just controlling you to do things for them. They're just a seductive narcissist often. And people only realize that 15 years later. Go and talk to people who are in these types of cults for 15, 20 years and gave their lives, and then they were thrown under the bus. Go and talk to them. You see? So they're pulled into this, and this is the system now that we have of spirituality. We have it, and it's rife. It's just full of corruption, you see. I remember somebody told me a story that they said, what do you think of this man who's supposed to be a sheikh? And I went to see him, and he was sitting there like decked out, like on a throne, like a sultan. And there were women on one massaging one arm and the other massaging his leg. They were not his daughters or anything like that. Clearly they were. And I said, is that what you saw? I said, you should have walked out at the moment you saw that. But generally speaking, this idea of this sultan sitting there, spirituality was never like that. If you go and read, Abul Harith al-Muhasibi, it's not. Where's the humility? Where's the but what they do is they use these kind of statements of spiritual masters to coax people into to obeying them and being their kind of pawns, you could say, and they can move them as they please. So you have many seductive narcissists in that field. Then you have the grandiose narcissist. They believe they are so exceptional that they don't have to conform to social norms like the rest of us. Also, again, corrupt spiritual people fall into this. They think they are exceptional even when they have achieved nothing. Sometimes they're loners, actually, and they just believe their own unrecognized genius despite having no accomplishments to speak of. So you do find the complete deluded people in that field as well. Some say Julian Assange is one of these guys. The WikiLeaks guy is one of these types of people. And in that type, you have the know-it-all narcissist, always showing off their superior knowledge. Now, this is found amongst students of knowledge and even amongst some ulama. You find this. And this is documented amongst the books of scholars have documented this amongst even types of scholars who are the know-it-all narcissist. And all while knowledge is and imparting knowledge is very important and it's good and it's part of our tradition and religion and it's valuable, they exploit other people through this to control them. They often take advantage of our need for intellectual and spiritual leaders, and they form spiritual cults and political movements. In fact, they're just narcissists that want control, and they use our spiritual tradition and our tradition of knowledge to achieve that. And that's why they say, read the books of Afatul Ilm, of the pitfalls of knowledge. Ghazali talks about this a lot. And they talk about a student, so-called, look at now the students of knowledge and how arrogant they are, prideful they are, how proud they are, how they use other people for their own advantage. We talked about the du'at already. We talked about the false spiritual leaders. Look at, for instance, Bikram Chaudhry, for instance, this guy, Bikram Yoga, who kind of manipulated all these kind of George Clooney and all these other guys, and he was a fraud. Some suggest that even Osho was a fraud in his own tradition sense, and I clearly think he was a fraud. And this, many others have been found to be frauds in kind of the Indian spiritual tradition. This kind of what Sadhguru is famous in now. that particular tradition as well. Many frauds they found, and it's exactly this. They were just either know-it-all, even sometimes a seductive narcissist and others, and they exploited women. Take Rasputin, for instance, the famous Russian. He believed that, he went and slept with all these women and believed that sin is the purging of sin is through more sin. That, so you have that as well, and we have it with our, how many of these sahibzadeh and peers are caught, raping women and all this. You see crazy stories you find. We had some in Birmingham. You've had in many cases, and that's why you have to be very careful of who you give your heart to. You see, and be very careful of that. So, how to cope with these things now? After highlighting, and by the way, so amongst know-it-all narcissists, you have all these social justice warriors, these vegans, climate change people, who have a black and white version of the world, and also these khilafa people as well. They have this black and white version of this world, and so they shoot down one party just to advance their own narcissism often. How do you cope with it? Now, some things that I want to briefly mention, and if we have follow-up sessions, we're going to talk about this in more detail. Is number one has to confront their own self-shame. They have to deal with their own childhood. They have to deal with their own lust that they may have had, or the difficulties they may have had, and they have to deal with it with anchorage, or knowing our tradition, knowing our spiritual tradition, and especially the solutions that often the Prophet ﷺ gave to these issues and these problems. And that also we have to stop being victims, that thinking that we have to live in our state of our sense of having a bad childhood, or being oppressed or being abused, and that's not a good place to live in. We can't move on from that often, and when we can't move on from that core shame, or kind of really understanding that, then we'll always be trapped within that paradigm. So one definite way is to confront our own shame, or our own childhood difficulties and problems we have, and how to improve ourselves spiritually, such that it's an advantage to our future, both spiritually, mentally, and physically, often because it affects us physically. Also, number two, don't be attached to a kind of a winner-loser paradigm, that everything's about either winning or losing. No, it's not about winning and losing. It's about being a better person. It's about improving ourselves spiritually, not being better than another person. This idea of riya and kibr, that it's about being a better self rather than winning or bettering another person, or losing in that sense that we lost. And that's why we have the idea of tawbah and istighfar. Why would we have that? Because sinners are losers, of course, but we have the idea that losers can remove that loss, you see, by making tawbah. And number three, one needs to accept what they see in the mirror, that we are who we are, in the sense that we have to improve ourselves. We can't change this body. Well, we can change the body, If you heard the clip of why all Maulvis are fat, that's been doing the rounds. Well, they shouldn't be. But the point, I'm not talking about body in that sense. I'm talking about when we look in the mirror, who we are. We shouldn't be ashamed of. We are who we are. You are what your name is. You can't get away from that, and that we have to accept that and improve the things that need improving, and make better the things that are already good. Okay. Yeah. So these are three suggestions: confronting one's own shame, don't be attached to being a winner or loser, and also do not accept what you see in the mirror. So that brings me to an end, inshallah, today of this particular discourse. I will take questions. Yeah. So inshallah, I'll take question. Now, I'm going to be honest, I was given that question last week, and Hamza reminded me of it, but I've been so busy, I didn't get time to think about it, and I'm not going to answer it because it's a deep question. So I will, Hamza, remind me again, and I do promise to give it a little more attention. I can't promise that I will definitely answer it by next week, but I will try my best to give it more attention this week, inshallah. Hamza, put someone, if you have any, on the WhatsApp group. Now on WhatsApp. I'll put some through as well, inshallah. I'll just wait a couple of minutes, and then inshallah I'll close up if there are no questions. How do students of knowledge veer away from traits you mentioned? Very easy. Number one, stick to the teacher you have. Stick with your teachers and learning, and don't involve yourselves with other students. There's no need to, and that's it. It's as simple as that. Stick to your studies, essentially. Stick to your studies and concentrate on that, and be guided through your studies. And don't be worried about other students; they're not your business. Do your study and then go home. That's it. Don't mix with other students. Don't talk to them. Don't keep the company. Especially if you think that these things will come up in discussions and things like that. Keep your childhood friends that you have, your normal friends, and friendship with them, and just don't hang around with them. So that's one definite solution. Will you please upload the other video as well? I won't. This one video is more complete, I think. So I'm just going to upload this one, inshallah. I don't know if I discussed certain things in that I didn't in this one. I'm sure I covered most of the things. Pretty sure. Should students teach others if they are struggling, or will this boost their own egos? Teaching should be guided always by other teachers, and good teachers as well. That teaching should always be guided in that you should put your concerns to your teacher, and your teacher to help you through that. And one should only teach once they've really studied properly, and also taken advice from teachers, and teachers push them that way, not by their own choice. As Imam Sheikh Ibn Aliwa says in his commentary of Abu Madin al-Ghad's poem, that about going out only for the truth, not for people, in the sense that only once completed that particular part of the study, and there's a need for them to teach as well. Remember, teaching is not something that you just take up because you want to in our tradition. It's because there's a need. And if there's a need and your teachers feel there's a need, then you go out there and you teach, inshallah. Otherwise, that's not the way our tradition works. How does one deal with bullying narcissists? So number one, it's inshallah, I'm going to address this in a future, because that's a really good question. And I would say that the phone icon, I don't understand that. I would say that oh, I think TG is my uncle, actually. He's saying phone me. Okay, okay. One way to deal with that is, number one, is you have to change your landscape, i.e., those people that are toxic in your life, you have to slowly remove them from your life. It can't be quick, of course, because then it'll be sudden, and the narcissist will take advantage of that and make you and pull you back in. But when it's slow, by busying yourself, etc., but definitely changing your landscape, your environment, and the people that are causing that in your life. Of course, it's much more difficult if you live with them. So I will, inshallah, deal with that when we get to the next part, the next segment that I do on narcissism, and how to deal with that, especially when people live with us and are affecting our lives. And I look at more solutions there. How would you help friends who are stuck in this cultish mindset? Take them to people that probably can help them, that are more in a position of power, that can get them out of, because cults normally need a counter narrative of the same level, so that helps in one sense. How do people deal with trauma? You mentioned about bullying parents, similar to how do those in spousal relationships situation. It's dynamic, it's different. Sometimes one needs counseling, therapy is necessary. Sometimes they just need to change their circle. Sometimes it's a number of things. It's not one thing. This question's too general. It depends on the person, depends on the circumstance. So sometimes it's changing little things. So maybe we can unpack this a bit more in that next segment, inshallah, and be a little more kind of detailed in that sense. And yeah, definitely. Inshallah, we'll stop there then if there are no more questions. Hope everybody enjoyed that and benefited, and I will see everybody next week for another discourse. It may be the follow-up to this, or I might break it up a little, because I've got so many other topics. Just before I log off, are there any other topics that one wants me to cover that would be interested in? Because I do want to cover relevant topics as well, and just because I think it's relevant, it may not be relevant. So yeah. So what to do if you do think so? when the video goes up, just put it into the YouTube comments, inshallah, and just put it on there. And I'll take that, and then we'll look at that, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.